We're going to get, ooh, this is a little hot. We're going to get started. I'll open us up in prayer, and then we'll do a quick little 7-minute exercise. We're not going to listen to music today. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this morning. Oops, not morning. Thank you for this evening in which we get to dive in and take a look at another facet of your word. Be with us as we study. In your name we pray, amen. Okay, so today, what we're going to look at is we're just going to do another practice. We're going to look at another of what I called a plot thread and what I also called a silhouette, okay? We're just going to look at, in other words, we're going to look at one of the long metaphors in Scripture, okay? I'm going to title this is not in your notes. I'm going to title this the question, were Adam and Eve priests in the garden? So that's what we'll call it. Were Adam and Eve priests in the garden? The subtitle is Humanity as Priest in Cosmic Temple. So this is a pretty big, it's a pretty big title, right? Were Adam and Eve priests in the garden? Maybe we're not thinking along these lines, but I'm going to just show us by thinking along in the context, reading along the contours of the literature, you'll be able to see this theme show up. So it's called Were Adam and Eve Priests in the Garden? And then the subtitle, Humanity as Priests in the Cosmic Temple. If you have space somewhere in your notes, you can write this out. And then there's these boxes, right? There's 4 of them, a big box, a smaller box in that box, and then a tiny box in that box. Okay? So the Bible begins with a pretty bold claim. It doesn't state it right out, but if you're reading the text, my argument is that a good Hebrew reader, somebody who's been through the scriptures many, many times, through the Tanakh many times, this is a resonance that they are instantly getting. Okay? So the first one is that the bold claim is all of creation is God's temple. We've heard that, right? This is your temple, right? All of creation is God's temple. So the first creation narrative, you can pull out your Bibles. We can go to Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And then I'll show you how it's depicted as a cosmic temple. Okay? The first creation narrative in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. 1, and to 2 and 3 depicts God as a cosmic temple builder. So let's just do a long form read as quick as we can. Genesis 1:1. Can somebody read that? Okay. Now the earth was formless and void and empty. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And then there was evening and morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." What does your word say there? Firmament? Okay, expanse. Okay, so one translation is expanse. Mine says vault. This is the NIV, the new NIV in 1995. That's the old NIV, though. So the new NIV has adjusted the word there to vault. I believe, Ninang, is that a King James, New King James? What does it say? 6, verse 6. Okay, firmament. Okay, so now let me just ask. So we have 3 words, firmament, vault, expanse. What other translations are there? Are there any other people with different words there? Okay, so right here we have 3 words. I've also heard the word dome in the NRSV. You can, if you pull up another passage, another translation, you have a different word, feel free to just blurt it out. But we have expanse, firmament, dome, vault. What are these things? What's a firmament? Right? What is, at its most base, what is a firmament? Huh? Okay, but remember that firmament is only the heavens in our mind because that's how it's used in Genesis. What is a firmament, though? Yeah, so the most literal firmament is something firm up there, okay? Something firm, okay? And then poets use they use the word firmament to describe the sky, right? Why would they use the word firmament to describe the sky? Something strong and firm. Yeah, something stretched out. Okay, so the word firmament, right, in its most literal, is something firm up there. And the stars are set in them, right, like little jewels or little holes, right? So holes within the firmament let light shine through. What is a dome? Right, a dome is like a, right? It's a dome. It's a spherical, yeah, it's a spherical ceiling. Right? You see it in temples, you see it at the Capitol building. What is an expanse? Oh, so let's do vault first. What is a vault? So where have you seen the word vault? So the word vault, so the roof is in the form of an arch, right? That's what a vault, like if you go to a church, you have vaulted ceilings, right? That's in the form of an arch, okay? What is an expanse? What's an expanse? What's an expanse? Anybody? Just what you think of when you hear the word expanse. What does it sound like? Wide, something big. What are you saying, Tasby? Yeah, space. Okay, so think about these 4 translations of this Hebrew word, right? 3 of those words have to do with something tangible, right? Vault it's an arched roof. Dome is also an arched roof. Firmament is a tangible, firm thing above you. But expanse is the one that is very different, right? Expanse is almost like it doesn't belong in the 3 as a synonym. Okay, so what is a good question? When you have 4 translations giving you 4 different words, what is a good instinct as a good Bible reader? What should you do? Okay, sure. So look at context. But it might be helpful to, okay, what Hebrew word are they translating, right? Because you have 4 different translations, but it's one Hebrew word. But the translators had decided that this makes most sense here, right? So now you have vault, dome, expanse, firmament, right? So you have that. So if those are 4 different translations, what should we do as good Bible readers, just good students of the Bible? What is the thing that we should try and do? Learn the Hebrew word. And what is the Hebrew word? How is it usually used? What's other ways it's used? So I'm going to write, I don't have space, but the word is R-A-K-I-A. Rakia. Okay? Rakia. Okay? That word for the word behind expanse, firmament, dome, vault, that's the word rakia. Okay? So what does the word rakia mean? Okay, no, it doesn't mean that. You have to remember that these are people who have no context for atmosphere yet. They haven't been to space and seen the ozone layer, right? So these are people who are from here. If I stand here and I look up, what does it look like up there? It looks like there's a big blue dome, right? If I'm standing in a field, it looks like I'm in a big blue dome. I was in Hawaii in 2019, and just standing in Hawaii, you can see mountains, 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 and it looks like the dome is being held up by the mountains. It really looks like that, right? Right now, we have a lot of buildings that keep us from seeing the wideness of the horizon. But if you're standing in a big field, it looks like end to end, it's blue, right? And then it gets dark, right? And so that you have that thing. It really does look like a dome, okay? And so you have this word rakia, which is a Hebrew word that most literally means, I guess, dome, but it comes from a Hebrew word, rakar, okay? And to rakar, what it means is to hammer something out, like out of bronze, okay? So things that you would rakar are shields, okay? You would rakar a shield. You would rakar something that would hold up the structure of a tent, okay? And so that's what you have. The word dome there is this is really hot. We have the word dome there as the most literal translation. So when you read Genesis 1 and you see the word expanse, vault, or what have you, you need to learn how to think, okay, dome is what's being set up there, right? So notice that the creation story is told as in a period of 7 days. This is very significant. Why is it important that there's a 7-day layering of the creation story? Okay, everybody knows that there's an importance with the number 7 in the Bible, right? But why is it important that this story is being told in a period of 7 days? Okay, just think about it. You've read the scriptures before, right? This is not your first time through the scriptures. Just make a guess. Okay, the day of rest is the 7th day, right? So a lot of things in the Hebrew tradition are being counted in sevens, in cycles of 7, in periods of 7, right? You have the Sabbath, and then all of the Sabbath law, like Jubilee, right? You have Yahweh resting on the 7th day, right? You have this it's important, right? And so this is very important because in the ancient Israelite world, temples were always dedicated with what? When the temple was built, what happened? Okay, sure. But what else happened? Huh? Yeah, they offered sacrifice, but just think about the story of the creation of the temple. When the temple was finally built, in the stories within the Nevi'im, right? What happened? They had a 7-day feast, right? A 7-day feast. They celebrated the temple for 7 days. Temples were always dedicated with a 7-day ceremony. This was not only true of the Israelites' temple, the one that they built for their God in Leviticus 8, 1 Kings 8, right? When they consecrated the tabernacle, there was a 7-day feast. When they built the temple, there was a 7-day feast. In Ezekiel, there's also a 7-day feast, but also of neighboring nations, right? So this isn't just an Israelite practice. 7s were significant for other ancient Israelites' neighbors, right? They would dedicate their temple, which they raised with a 7-day feast. This was so deeply ingrained into all of the neighboring countries of the 7-day cycles that Israelites would have immediately understood the 7-day creation to associate with what? A temple, right? So you have a 7-day cycle. Israelites would automatically know because they're given clues already. What else has a dome? The temple, right? What else has, you have okay, let's keep reading. In Genesis, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from the water. So God made the vault, and then he called the vault sky or heavens. And then there was evening and morning the 2nd day. And God said, let water under be gathered to one place and let dry ground appear, right? So the water is gathered, and it's like if you're sweeping water away so that you can let the dry ground appear. That's what happened, right? The water was moved away from the dry ground, and the dry ground was revealed, right? He called the dry ground earth, haaretz, and he called the waters the seas, right? And God saw that it was good, and then vegetation, and then God said, let there be what? Lights, right? In the sky, in the vault of the sky, okay? That word lights, does anybody have maybe like a footnote there behind it? Does anybody have anything for lights there? Okay, so that word right there is ha'or. Okay, ha'or. Okay, what does ha'or mean in Hebrew? So in English, what does light look like? What do you think they're talking about? When it says in this passage right there, and God said, let there be light in the vault of the sky, what is he talking about? Right? Lights in the sky. Okay, so we're thinking sun, moon, and stars. That's very good. But what does the word ha'or mean in Hebrew? It only occurs a couple of other times in the text. Can anybody guess where the other occurrence is? In the stories of the tabernacle and the temple. Right? Ha'or means lantern or lamppost. Okay, this is very important, right? And what are the lampposts? The menorah that are the lampstand, exactly. They're the ones that are on either side of the altar, inside, right? So this is important because now you have the vault, which is in the temple, right? And you have the temple, which is being adorned with what? What does the temple and the tabernacle, if you could look at the artwork of the temple and the tabernacle, what does it look like? There's pomegranates, there's trees and fruits and fig trees that smells like bread. There's lampposts, right? There's embroidered leaves, right? It's dazzling with wood and things like that. What else is there? There's angels, right? The cherubim are there, right? So you have garden imagery, right? And so you have the garden imagery in the garden, and you have the words that are appearing in the temple, and then in the future temple and the tabernacle, they appear as well, right? So they're being shown to you as a unity. Okay, let's keep going, right? So there's a 7-day creation story showing you that there's a 7-day, this is the 7-day inauguration of a temple. We can see the Israelites' understanding of the design of creation in the 3-part design of the Israelite tabernacle and temple, which is the Holy of Holies, holy place, and the courtyard. So I'm going to show you this, okay? So this is the sea, right? Which is Genesis 1:10. Okay? And then here you have the land, trees, animals, humans, right? And then here you have the skies. Okay? That's Genesis 1:6-8. Then you have here the courtyard. What do you have next? The holy place where the sacrifice is actually offered. What do you have next? The Holy of Holies. The HH, right? So this parallel states a significant truth about creation itself, right? The cosmos, the world that we live in, itself is a macro temple, right? And the temple is like a miniature cosmos, right? It's just like the ark. The ark had also 3 levels, right? It's important. And then what was above the ark? The sky. What was below the ark? All the waters. It's important, right? And so here, just as the ancient worshipers placed a statue of their God in the heart of the temple, right, in the most central part of the temple, you have humanity being placed in the center of the garden as a tselem. The Hebrew word is tselem. What is tselem again? I've done it multiple times in church on Sunday. What does the Hebrew word tselem mean? It's the same word for idol or statue, right? So in Genesis 1, you have what's being set up in the center of this garden, right? Being talked about with temple imagery, and in the center is an idol to this God. And this idol to this God, their name is Adam and Eva, humanity and life, right? And so there you go. You have an embodied physical image of a divine creator and king in Genesis 1, 26 and 27. So heaven and earth are not meant to be separate realms. You actually have the sky realm existing in relation with the cosmos, right? The sea, the land where people dwell, and then the skies. So they're not meant to be separate realms, right? Rather, they are completely overlapping in the garden, right? The space in which God dwells is the same space in which humanity is dwelling. That's the unity. But that's broken, right, at the fall. Right? So God appointed creation as the place where humans would be united with the beauty and the presence of God for all eternity. And so now to look at Garden of Eden as a temple, if all of God's creation already is a temple, and in the middle of this cosmic temple, God creates another temple, which is the garden, right? The concept of Eden, which means just delight, is described as, if you can just look at the way that it's talked about, the way that the Garden of Eden is talked about in 1 and 2. What are some things you could say about what it looks like? Right? Right, so you had water, and then the water is pushed away and gathered so that dry land could what? Emerge. So when something emerges, what does that shape sort of look like? Like an outshoot, right? Like an outcrop, right? If it emerges, if this is the water, and then the water is gathered, and then dry land emerges, you have what looks like a mountain, right? So the Garden of Eden, the place where man dwells with God, is described as this mountain temple, which would not be unfamiliar to ancient readers, right? Because the Great Pyramids of Egypt, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the ancient palace gardens all across the ancient world, they built their palaces and temples on what? Mountains. If you go to Japan, where are all the temples? At the top of a mountain. If you go to Egypt, where are the temples? At the highest place. Why? Because usually there's water, right? There's things grow there. In the valleys, what's not there? Water. It's a lot of desert, right? If you look at a satellite map of the ancient world, the highest places are where the water is and the green is, and then everything below is desert. Okay? So all of these ancient cultures were building temples on mountains. And so these buildings were designed to evoke that kind of transcendence and awe. They were sacred spaces where humans met with gods. You have Mount Olympus, right? You have the ancient mountains all across the Asian world, right? Right? You have Moab. What is the mountain that they thought Baal would be? Mount Ararat. I mean, not Mount Ararat, Mount Carmel, right? And then you have the mountain where Jesus has his transfiguration, right? These are all in the minds of these ancient people. And only priests were allowed inside most temples, right? Because they function as what? Mediators between God and that humanity that dwells below, right? So in the ancient Near East, the temple was the center and mainstay of creation. We see that literally in the way that Jerusalem's society was ordered, right? Everything was centered around the temple. If you look at the ancient Israelites as they were traveling across the wilderness, how did they set up their camp? I bet you never paid attention, but how did they set up their camp? The temple is in the middle, right? The tabernacle is in the middle, and then they pitched their tents around it. But prior to the building of the tabernacle, where was Moses meeting? Outside of the group, right? The tent was outside of the camp, right? Only until the building of the tabernacle and the 7-day creation did he come and dwell in the tabernacle, right? So it's important, right? So you have here in the Genesis account, the Garden of Eden is being depicted as the center, the focal point for humanity and the presence of God, right? As the center and mainstay of God's creation. So the design plan of Eden is a prototype of the tabernacle and the temple. This narrative is meant to show you the priesthood in its in utero almost, right? And the Holy of Holies is the Israelite tabernacle and temple. So this map of Genesis 2:4-18 imitates that of the holy space. So if you go to Genesis 2, you have the dry land. right? And then you have land of Eden, right? In the midst of the dry land, you have Eden, right? And in the midst of the land of Eden, you have what? The Garden of Eden. And then in the midst of the Garden of Eden is what? The tree, right? The tree of life in the center of the garden. And what else was in the center of the garden? The tree of the knowledge of good and bad, right? Of Tov and Ra, right? And so you have here the land of Jerusalem, land of Israel. Okay? And then within the land of Israel you have the courtyard. Right? And then within the courtyard you have what? Holy place. Right? And then within the holy place, the Holy of Holies. Right? So later on in the Hebrew Bible, God instructed the Israelite leaders to incorporate garden imagery into the tabernacle and the temple. Right? The tree of life, Genesis 2:9, is symbolized by the lampstand, right? In the tabernacle and the temple, right? That's why it's a pronged lampstand, right? Exodus 25:31-40, that's the lampstand. The danger of the middle of the garden is just like the danger of the Holy of Holies, right? The danger of holy ground for Jacob at Bethel and for Moses and for the Israelites at the base of Mount Sinai, right? Just like Moses had a dangerous encounter with God at the base of Mount Sinai at a bush, a tree, right? The word for tree there is the same. The word for bush in the Moses story is 8, right? And the word for tree and bush is just 8. It's just tree, right? So Moses had a dangerous encounter with the presence of God at a tree, right? It is very important. The tree of knowing good and bad. I say good and bad because tov means good. Right? But it doesn't necessarily mean moral good, right? Tov, like mazel tov, right? It just means good, beautiful, great, wonderful, right? And then you have, Yeah. So it just means good. It doesn't have any moral weight. And then when you have Ra, it doesn't mean evil, actually. The word Ra, you can call your tooth, if you have a cavity, that is a raw tooth. It's a bad tooth. It's not good for life. It's not living, right? So yeah, the knowledge of good and bad, right? And it's in the center of the garden, and it's not to be approached. Genesis 2:17. It's like the tablets of the Torah placed in the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies in Deuteronomy 31:26. And those tablets of the Torah are Israel's wisdom, right? That's Deuteronomy 4. And it's not just Israel's wisdom. Those tablets within the tablets of the Torah within the Ark of the Covenant are also described as Israel's life, right? So you have the wisdom or the knowing tablets and the tablets of life within the Holy of Holies in the Ark of the Covenant. And just as the entrance to Israel's first temple faced what direction? East. So the temple faced east. So if you were going into the temple, what direction are you headed? Westward, right? Westward. And it was situated on a mountain, right? They put it on a mountaintop at the highest point in Jerusalem, right? The future temple described in Ezekiel was also to what? Face east, right? Israel had a vision. He was standing to the east of the temple, right? And it was supposed to be built on a new mountain called Zion, right? Similarly, where did Eden's entrance face? Think John Steinbeck's magnum opus, East of Eden, right? He wrote a book about leaving Salinas, right, and the trials of farming. But East of Eden, right? They left east, the door, and then the angel with brandishing the flaming sword is east, right? So important. Similarly, that's also on a mountain, right? An eastward-facing entrance on a mountain, right, where you would meet, if you pass through that way, you would meet with the presence of the Lord. These designs are intentional. Every image points back to the garden temple of Eden, right? When Israel was estranged from their covenant promises, what direction did they go? East, right? East of the temple, into the Babylonian wastes, right? Yeah, and then returning west. So now read the stories of the Torah, right? Because they're prefiguring the exile, right? They're talking when Adam and Eve stay to just outside the entrance of Eden, trying to get back in, right? You should be thinking of exile already, right? That's already in your heart. When you see Abraham sojourning from where? Babylon, right? He's going west. But every time he went west, what did he do instead? He would go south, he would go, right? He would go everywhere but where he was supposed to go, right? He went down to Egypt, he wasn't supposed to, right? It's important that you start to notice the traveling because they're thinking this way. They're leaving little breadcrumbs for you to see the story and the drama that develops, okay? The designs are intentional. So Adam and Eve as priests in the Garden of Eden. If the biblical authors wanted us to see the garden as a temple, right, as the image of a temple, the silhouette of the temple begins in the garden, right, begins in that mountain garden. And then every time you hear in the Psalms about the Mount of Zion, or the strong tower, or the refuge in the mountains, that's important, right? It's important that we're thinking along these lines because these are all silhouettes for the temple, right? If the biblical authors wanted us to see the garden as temple, then the question is begged, are we to see Adam and Eve as priests? Actually, it seems that this is exactly what the authors had in mind, right? Thinking about their ancestors would later be called what? A nation of priests, right? It's important. So actually, it seems this is exactly what the authors had in mind in the garden temple. Humanity served as what? Stewards. Yeah, managers of the temple. They were supposed to have dominion, right? But who has dominion over a temple? The priests. They're supposed to take care of it, right? That word is actually only ever used of priests again in Leviticus, right? This initial blessing to Adam and Eve, it's priestly duties, right? And what are they supposed to do? Tend to the garden, right? Right? They're supposed to be stewards. In the Hebrew Bible, the temple was where priests uniquely experienced God's presence, right? The priests, out of all of Israel, only a few of them would get to experience the presence of God like that, as mediator, right? That behind the curtain, if you couldn't come through, I would lead your sacrifice in as a representative for you, right? Right? The women would have to stay out, but the men would come in. And then, again, out of that group of priests who were representative, only one could go into the most dangerous spot and meet with the Lord, right? It's the same kind of presence that when at the foot of Mount Sinai, after the story of Exodus, they just left Egypt, God says, come up to the mountain, right? They camped at the base of Mount Sinai, and there's a storm on the top of the mountain, and then he says, come to the top of the mountain. What do the people say? They were afraid. No, you go, Moses. Right? We don't want to go. You go. You go up for me. And then God says, well, if they won't listen to me, then I'll talk with you. You tell them when I get down. And before he can get down, what happens? They're already building an idol. Moses is taking too long. Right? It's very important. Okay? And so in the Hebrew Bible, the temple was where the priests experienced uniquely the presence of God, and then the high priest most uniquely, right? In the garden, humanity fully experienced God's presence, right, within the structure. They dwelled with him, right? You have that story in the cool of the day. There was a walk, right? God was walking in the coolness of the day, looking for Adam. Adam, where'd you go? You're supposed to be here, right? And so Adam and Eve were supposed to experience the presence of God, walking and talking, hopefully growing in wisdom, right, rather than seizing it from a tree, right? But growing in wisdom, right? They're young. They were just born yesterday, right? Right? And so there's a long relationship being formed. And the Hebrew verbal form, hithpael, used for God's walking back and forth in the garden, Genesis 3:8, also describes God's presence in the tabernacle. So that walking is also the same words, the same verbal form used for God's movement within the tabernacle and the temple. in Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 23, Samuel 7, Ezekiel 28. Additionally, in Genesis 2:15, humanity's work is described using priestly vocabulary, right? Yahweh Elohim took the human and placed him onto the Garden of Eden, onto, right? There's another preposition telling you about the mountain, right? Onto the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it, right? These two verbs in Genesis 2:15 are packed with significance because when they're next to each other like that, they portray the priestly vocation, right? The Hebrew word abad means to work, abad, or to serve, right? Like the son of Boaz, right? Obed means to work or servant, right? To worship, and also alternatively to worship. It's a common verb and it's used for all kinds of things. One, for cultivating soil, farmers abad, right? Genesis 2:5, 3:23, 4:2, 4:12. However, the word is also commonly used in a religious sense of serving God, Deuteronomy 4:19, and within all of the priestly texts regarding the tabernacle duties especially. Right? Duties of the Levites, Numbers 3, 7, and 8, 4:23, 24, 4:26. The second Hebrew word that's not abad is shamar, right? Shamar, right? Means to keep, which is commonly used for a priestly service of worship, as well as in the legal text of observing the religious commands, right? And duties of the Leviticus, of the Levites. Right, so Leviticus 18:5. So you shall keep my statutes and my judgments. Shamar. Right? The word is also used for the Levitical responsibility of guarding the tabernacle from intruders in Numbers 1:53. Right? Here's the quote. But the Levites shall camp around the tabernacle of the testimony so that there will be no wrath on the congregation of the sons of Israel. Right? So you're supposed to guard from the intruders. Right? And guarding the presence of the Lord, what do we know about Levites that we probably don't think about? I know that you already know this, you just haven't made the connection yet. Describe a Levite to me. What was that? What was it? I can't hear it. Yeah, they're priests, right? What do they look like? Try and describe what they look like or what they're like. Yeah, they look like soldiers. Remember at the Exodus story? In the Exodus story, at the very beginning of right after the golden calf, who had the sword strapped to their waists? It was the Levites, right? It was the Levites guarding the presence, right? Just like the angel guarding the presence, right? This is very important to make connections. So the Levites, why would they also have swords? Because they were killing animals all day, left and right, just killing animals, killing animals, killing animals. They were butchers, essentially, right? They would butcher the meat, they would remove fat, it was a very bloody affair for the Levites, right? And so they were charged with guarding, the shamar, right? So these two verbs, abad and shamar, are used together as a phrase to refer either to Israelites serving and guarding, or obeying God's word, or more frequently of the priests and Levites who serve God in the temple, and those who guard the temple. As God's priestly representatives, Adam and Eve were made to be mediators between God and others, right? Relating with God on behalf of other people and reflecting his character to others through love, compassion, generosity, and justice. As priests, Adam and Eve were tasked to care for this sacred space, right? They were supposed to take care of the garden, right? They were to work and to serve. That's what it means to be image of God, right? To work and to serve with royal authority. Right? It'd been given to you, work and serve it. Right? By participating with God in the task of upkeeping creation, upholding and sustaining order. Right? And so God tasked humanity with using their own abilities as humans and imagination to spread order and beauty of the garden temple out into the rest of creation. Thinking of Ezekiel's dream, right? Ezekiel's vision. He's standing at the east, he sees the temple, and the temple is trickling water. And then it's going into the Dead Sea. It trickles, it becomes a small brooklet, and then it becomes a little river. He can wade to his knees, he can wade to his waist. Now he's swimming up to his neck, and it's going into the Dead Sea, which is full of salt. but the water from the temple is turning it fresh, and trees are growing, right? That's the vision of what's supposed to happen with the temple. But knowing their original priestly function only makes the story of Genesis 3 all the more tragic, right? Because Adam and Eve's rebellion in Genesis 3, it really taints the priestly order. They take and eat from the tree of knowing good and bad, and they spread mistrust, right? God doesn't want what's best for you. He's holding out on us, right? You did this to me, the woman you gave me, right? You didn't have what was best for me at heart. You gave me like a cheat, right? Or a liar, right? That's immediately. Mistrust, violence, and death to the whole world spread from the Garden of Eden because of Adam and Eve and their children and their children's children, right? God exiles humanity from the garden to the east and ordered the garden temple into the chaos of the wilderness, right? But in the chaos of the wilderness, they were still fruitful and they still multiplied, right? But instead of multiplying Tov, what did they multiply? Ra, right? They multiplied Ra. So much so that when you get to the story of the flood, they filled the earth, but with Hamas and Ra, right? Bad and violence, right? Not good. So the ideal that the priestly vocation was supposed to represent, Adam and Eve failed, right? And they were exiled. But the exile was not without hope, because before they leave the garden temple, Adam and Eve receive a promise for what? A baby tree, right? A seed, right? The word there is seed, but if you read Genesis, the only things that have seeds are fruit-bearing trees, right? That's a very important thing. But it also means offspring. So there's a little baby tree that's promised that's supposed to be the offspring of the woman, and it's supposed to crush the head of the serpent at some point, right? Who would come to defeat evil and restore creation, and he will be the one to fulfill the priestly role, right? And then this ideal of design of creation, the garden temple, humanity's role as priests, it teaches us about our ideal role as humanity. Humans were created to be priestly representatives as divine image bearers, right? I gave a sermon once about how we're all image bearers, but sometimes that image is tarnished. Sometimes it's not as shiny as it could be, right? Humans were created to be good representatives of this God. We were created to relate with God and reflect his character to others. We were created to work and to serve, to uphold and sustain this kind of beauty and order, and spread life out into the world. And so the question becomes, how then are we fulfilling this ideal as followers of Jesus in the 21st century, right? How are we living out our intended roles as priests? How are we reflecting God's character to those around us? How are we pursuing things like compassion and justice and order and beauty, just like you would in the garden, right, to the rest of creation? So this creation account, thinking along the lines of a Hebrew reader, right, teaches us and invites us to ponder and reflect on our role as priests and how we are fulfilling it or not fulfilling it, right? Our failure to live up to that ideal and the hope we have because of Jesus, the future seed, right, who created a new humanity and a new kingdom of priests who will one day reunite heaven and earth with a little phrase that Jesus calls faith like a mustard seed, which would grow into a big tree, right? And this new creation, this new garden, humanity will work and serve. Once again, that's just a little quick. Genesis 1 is packed with this kind of thing, right? And learning to exercise this, just the simple question of what are these words meaning? What's the word behind this? I've noticed this 5 different translations. What's the root? Can that give me an insight into the way the ancient people are thinking? Right? Why did they use the word seed and not just use the word child? They know what a child is, right? But why did they use seed? Right? Is seed important in the passage? Those are the questions we are learning to ask. Okay? We left off at session 12, right? Or did we finish session 12? We finished it? Okay. Yeah. So I'll just wrap up session 12 really quick. So we talked about the aspen grove, and we talked a lot about the better example or the better metaphor, to look at it as a quilt and a grove of aspens, right? And so what this unlocks for us, what learning to read the Hebrew Bible as a quilt and an aspen grove, what it teaches us and our brains to think like, is along the lines of the intertextual highway, right? Though you can just see there's a bunch of stuff that we could have talked about. We could have just hopped off a little bit on, like, taken a little detour and then followed a whole pathway down, right? There's a lot of seed talk. There's a lot of tree talk, right? We didn't go that way. There's a lot of Tov and Ra talk. There's the word serpent, which is nachash in Hebrew, right? But the word nachash is the same thing as wise man. There's a whole like fork in the road you could go there. Daniel was a wise man. Solomon was a wise man, right? The people in Jesus' story, they traveled, they were wise men, right? It's very important, but also serpent. There's a dangerous road of wisdom, right? Wisdom can be used for all sorts of ways. You saw it in Solomon, right? Solomon at his best was, people were coming. Oh, what's happening in Jerusalem? But at his worst, what? He's a womanizer. He was morbidly rich. He split a country in two, right? This is those are the stories. So learning to think in these two metaphors helps us to see the intertextuality. The Bible is interpreting itself and commenting on itself, commenting on earlier things, commenting on later things, right? It's important, okay? So if you expand that out, when we're learning like this, it's like getting the DNA code of biblical literature and then being able to see all of the different connections, right? How to read biblical narrative, which accounts for 2/3 of the Hebrew Bible. Some things will start to unlock when you can see an image and see how it's applied to every little section, right? So now we're going to spend some time in Hebrew poetry. Then we're going to spend some time in how to read Hebrew narrative. And then we'll find ourselves learning how to session with ourselves, like a jam session artist, so as we read, to learn the intertextuality between the narrative and the poetry and the discourse, right? So that's the task, right? And what I will do, we're going to get into Unit 3 in just a second, but we're going to go to the last session of Unit 2, which is 13, right? And this one is called what? What is this one called? This session? Yeah, different? Okay, different encyclopedias. I won't finish encyclopedia over there. Right? So now we're something at the hinge of our exploration. We've gotten a lot of history done. We've gotten a lot of basics of reading done. But we're at the hinge, a hinge point where we're going to swing from how the Hebrew Bible was written and what techniques, right? The issues that I've tried to surface and raise for you all, for me, and the set of questions, right? How do I go about reading a text that consists of many texts, right? But that's been organized all together as a text of many texts, right? And text, there's a lot of them, right? So how do you go about reading something like that, right? What I'm going to do right now is actually put a couple of items on the table that are a little bit along the realm of literary theory, which is something maybe y'all have never heard of. Maybe it's something that you guys are familiar with. But I find that when they were introduced to me, they gave me new categories for how to think. So a lot of times I use this metaphor or this image of rearranging furniture or rearranging shelves, right, in our head. So we have mental shelves, right? Maybe the Bible sits on this shelf, right? And it's neat here, right? But what we just learned is that if you turned it on its side, there's a bunch of things inside that. And then they actually can be organized differently. And so what we're doing is just training ourselves to restructure our thinking, right? And so this will give us some more categories for when we encounter any text, not just the Hebrew Bible, right? But specifically, of course, for our purposes, the ancient text that communicates in ways that are foreign to me, right? So this is literally a literary study on a foreign culture. That's what we're going to do. Right? So it's about adopting a new sensibility for reading an ancient text, right? We usually read ancient texts like we would read any text, right? Because that's how we were trained to. We weren't trained to particularly practice a historian's lens or a literary scholar's lens, right? And not for any fault of anyone, right? We didn't have literary scholars at my Christian school growing up, right? We had teachers, well-meaning teachers, who learned what they learned, right? And they're sharing. So here we are at a different point in our life, and we're going to try and practice a new sensibility. Let's start. This is actually very hard, okay? So if this is hard for you or challenging for you, you just got to be patient with yourself, right? Because if you're grown up familiar with the Bible in a certain way, what we run the risk of is the Bible no longer feels foreign, right? We become overly familiar with a text that is ancient, right, and cross-cultural, right? You might say that was not my experience, but this is an ancient experience that we read, right? And so the challenge is that we have to allow the Bible to once again become foreign to us so that it can become like a new country that we're visiting for the first time, and I'm beside myself and I need to learn the customs if I'm going to relate, right? And so I need to rediscover. So I find some tools. Some of these tools can help do that for us. But it's just a good thing to recognize in our heads, like write down maybe a date in your notes, August 26, 2021. This is maybe the first day that you decided that every time I'm going to open the Bible, I am entering into another foreign context, right? So you can make a little milestone marker for you, right? Just a good thing to recognize, right? Right? So here's a couple of revolutionary ideas that sound so basic that you might not think that they need to be said, but I think that they pack immense potential, right? So revolutionary idea number one, okay? Think of the theme that we have been talking about, right? Right? The Bible, the Old Testament, is an ancient text, right? Is it more than an ancient text? Yeah, right? This is our scripture. It's a holy text for us. Right? But if you're not Jewish or you're not Christian, it's just an ancient text, right? So that's still true, right? But for us, it's also more, right? So think of that theme we've been talking about, the ongoing word that these texts can speak to us, but it's not any less than an ancient text, right? It begins there. It's an ancient text, right? And it was produced in another language, multiple languages, Aramaic, borrowed Egyptian, Hebrew, early Arabic, right? Hebrew and Aramaic. And here's another revolutionary idea, right? That seems so simple, but it needs to be said. Texts are intentional products of literary communication. Texts are intentional products of literary communication. That seems redundant because it's a text, but texts are intentional products of literary communication. In other words, when I encounter any text, but especially the text of the Hebrew Bible, every single thing that's being put in front of me is there for a reason. It was intentionally edited over many years to be that precise, right? Every single thing that's being put in front of me is there for a reason. When you become over-familiarized with the Bible, you just gloss. You just paint in way too big of a picture, right? You forget that there's minutia. If you've ever read, if you go back to your time reading books for school, teachers would tell you all of these little things if you just look at it this way, right? The Hebrew Bible is no different, right? So when you become over-familiarized with the Bible, or I'm thinking how it was said earlier that there's the history part, that's the history part, right? Here's the poetic part, that's the poetic part, right? And when you grow up with that conception, I find that it acts like a sleep drug on people as they read. Other parts of their thinking fall asleep because they're in history mode. Other parts of their thinking fall asleep because they're in poetry mode, right? They forget to read with the nuance, right? And people just kind of dull their awareness as they come to read this expertly crafted literature, right? And we just tend to think, well, the history stuff is just stuff that happened, so I don't really need to know the significance of the dates or the places or the names of the people. I get the general gist. Abraham passed through, right? And it was fine, right? But when you start to read with nuance, then you recognize, where did Abraham pass through? Is that on the way to where he was supposed to be going, or is it not? Why did he go to Egypt? Why did he say that was his sister? Then you start, I hope Egypt doesn't factor into the family history later on, and it does, right? So you have all these prefigured foreshadowing and thing like that. So once you get the basic outline of events, we start to think, why do we keep reading? Why do I have to read it again, right? I remember one of my good friends, when we study the Bible together, he'll have questions and he'll say, I've already read the stories. I don't understand why I have to read it again. If you know me, I'm a serial movie rewatcher. If I love a movie, I'll watch it over and over and over again. I'll watch it once a year. I'll watch it every 6 months, right? And I find something new every time. But if you allow your brain to think, I've seen it once, I've seen it all, then you cheat yourself, right? You cheat yourself out of the richness of a text like this, right? And so it's why many people who grew up on children's media of the Bible never graduate from a children's media read of the Bible, right? And they've never read it for themselves. This is what I call the VeggieTales syndrome, is that if you grew up reading VeggieTales or listening to VeggieTales, then the story of King David and Nathan and Uriah and Bathsheba is just King George and the Ducky to you, right? That's it, right? And so this is why I think this is helpful. Even just that little thing we did with Judges, Samuel and Ruth, right? Little phrases, when they appear at strategic locations for purposes, right? It's all very intentional. Maybe here's a way of theorizing about this. So there's a chart in your sheets, right? Right? There's a chart there. The issue I'm about to raise is actually infinitely complex and interesting. We can only spend a little bit of time on it, right? But that's not my purpose in bringing it up, talking about all of the infinitely complex versions of this, right? This chart is just a helpful tool that got me thinking in new categories, right? This is like a fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. This chart is the beginning of understanding the Bible. It's not the end of it, right? So these texts were produced by ancient authors. Theologically, I share the conviction of the authors and of this whole tradition that through these human words, I hear a divine word. But that divine word comes to me through what? A human word, right? It's the only way that I know that there's a divine word is that I experience through the human word of the text. So I'm encountering another mind when I open the pages of a Hebrew Bible, right? Because there's a mind that placed those words on that page, right? So we'll call this author embedded in there that is human and Holy Spirit, the whole thing. However, do I have access to a biblical author in the same way I have access to my dad? I do not, right? Do I have access to a biblical author in the same way that I have access to somebody who writes me a letter? No, right? Of course not. Somebody who writes me a letter, that's an act of intentional literary communication, right? But I can give them a call and follow up, right? I can be like, what did you mean when you wrote that? You drew a little picture at the end and you didn't clarify. I don't know what that is, right? There's a strange word. I don't understand what you meant there, right? We don't have that opportunity with the biblical authors, right? And so it creates this interesting dynamic. Even though the meaning of the text is what somebody meant to write, I don't have access to that unmediated, right? The meanings, the author's intent is absolutely there, but I don't have a one-to-one relation with that meaning, right? It involves a dialogue with somebody who can't speak back to me, right? This is the challenge, right? Even though the meaning of the text is what somebody meant to write, in the case of ancient texts and the biblical text, what we have to clarify what any of this means, all that we have access to is the text, right? Right? The author is pointing our way in terms of we have an arrow pointing that the author produces a text, read this, right? And the text reaches me as the audience, but the ongoing life of the reader is the continual reading of the text, right? Have you ever read a text message, tried and do what the text message said, and you realize you didn't read it right? Right? You do that all the time. I did it today. I work at a shop and I was citing up a delivery, right? And I just got the email wrong. I heard tomcat.net, but it's comcast.net. So the invoice didn't go to the right place and they kept calling, but I read it. I just read Tomcat instead of Comcast. So it's simple like that, right? And so here's the ongoing life of the reader with the text is to continually read that text. Here's what I think somebody is trying to say to me. Am I right or am I wrong? If I'm right, how right? If I'm wrong, how wrong? Right? You have to keep asking that question. And how do I know that I'm this right? How do I know that I'm this wrong? Right? All you have before you is the text. So you got to go back, right? Right? And read again. This is true especially of literary texts, texts that were intentionally crafted and edited to be read for your understanding, right? Like a little note isn't quite the same thing as a literary text, right? But this is a work that's been edited together. Texts that have been carefully, intentionally formed according to stylistic conventions, to look and feel a certain way, that indicates richness of meaning and purpose, which is usually what the word literature refers to, right? So it's literature, but like email and letter, but like email and a letter, that's not literature in our culture, right? But a novel or a collection of poetry is. So now we're talking about types of texts that have been so carefully crafted that you won't actually get everything on first pass. It's by design, right? You won't get everything on the first reading. One of my favorite authors, James Joyce, wrote a book called Ulysses. And the book Ulysses is insanely difficult. Ulysses is this thick, and the commentary that I have for Ulysses is this thick. It's 3 volumes. And because each chapter is a different literary style, there's a prevailing color for each chapter. One of the words, there's no punctuation in one chapter. In one chapter, it's stream of consciousness. One chapter is a song. It's meant for you to not get it on first pass. And when he was asked about that text, he said, I write so that scholars for years and years and years would be trying to figure out what I never told them I wrote about. That's the point. He wants people to continue to read and to dig in, right? And so what we're dealing with in the Bible is a literary text. It's actually through the process of reading and rereading and rereading and rereading that you gain more and more clarification, right? But rereading and then reading and then rereading are 2 different acts, right? If I read and then I skimmed again, all I did was do the first pass. I'm just doing the first reading again. But reading and then rereading involves a different approach every time, right? And so you have some texts are designed to be reread many times. And when you're thinking of a text like the Hebrew Bible, I mean, think of Psalm 1, right? How long? Psalm 1 or Joshua 1, right? Which is a portrayal of the ideal reader of Tanakh, of somebody who reads day and night, right? How many years of study and meditation is expected out of the Psalm 1 reader? Yeah, ad infinitum, right? For the rest of your life, right? Day and night, your whole life. So I've come to be really convinced that that actually should be taken at face value. To see the bigger picture and all of what's happening here requires a lifetime of consistent, not just reading, but rereading, which means that you challenge earlier conventions. You try a different reading on for size. Does it cohere with the rest of the text? No? Does it cohere with the text in a challenging way? Right? That's how you do it. You have to read and reread, right? How many years of study and meditation? The rest of your life, right? So which is remarkable to think about a text that's designed that way, right? But I'm convinced that this is the case. Here's what can complicate this, however, right? There's a literary theorist whose name is Umberto Eco, okay? Umberto Eco. And he wrote a famous book, and it was made into a movie. Name of the Rose. Okay? Name of the Rose. He uses this phrase that I found helpful, that all of us walk around with a mental encyclopedia. This is this phrase. All of us have a mental encyclopedia. And you're building this encyclopedia from your first waking moments. All your memories, all your associations, everything that you've ever unconsciously or consciously filed away that helps you make sense of the world. Our brains are doing this with language, with our visual, audio, everything, right? We're walking around with reference points. Our brains are constantly organizing reality for us so that we don't have to reprocess everything when we first see it, right? However, based on the culture and the time that that person is existing and the place you grew up with, your encyclopedia will inevitably be different than mine. My point of reference is different than your point of reference. If we grew up with the same language and culture, chances are we'd have some overlap. But if I grew up in South Long Beach and somebody grew up in Beverly Hills, we have a different encyclopedia altogether, right? If you grew up poor or you grew up with money, your encyclopedia is different, right? Your reference points for what's normal, what's not normal is different, right? I don't know if it's technically possible at all for any human to have the same encyclopedia as another, right? Because we're all such unique individuals, right? You even ask, I know a few identical twins, and they could not be any more different from each other in terms of even outlook, right? And so authors are working with what Eco calls an encyclopedia of production. This is what Umberto Eco calls an encyclopedia of production. Every author is working with an encyclopedia of production, whether they realize it or not. So what they have is their whole life experience, and then when they write out of that encyclopedia. In the same way, as a reader, when I come to a text, I have an encyclopedia, right? But I don't share the encyclopedia with the author, right? Which represents a challenge that if I don't pay attention to, I'll bowl over his encyclopedia or their encyclopedia, right? So the great challenge of any act of communication is to bridge the two encyclopedias. The author has an encyclopedia of production, right? One they produce writing out of. But I have an encyclopedia as a reader, the encyclopedia of reception, where I will receive these writings, right? So the great challenge of any act of communication between me and an author is the text, right? And I have to bridge the encyclopedias, or at least to make an attempt to see the differences and make connections between them, right? I'm an optimist thinking that genuine communication can take place between two human beings, right? My friendships have been teaching me about communication from day one. It's one of the most difficult things to do, and nobody's perfect at it. But this is just a fancy way of saying, am I willing to set aside my agenda as I read to hear the agenda of the author? Which is a challenge, right? It's a challenge for two speakers to do, right? Who have direct access to each other, right? It's even more difficult for a person who cannot defend their point of view, right? Because it's the text, right? And so, am I willing to put aside my agenda of what I'm going to say next in response to this, to hear fully the voice of the author, the one who's writing? That actually sounds like Sermon on the Mount, right? Love your neighbor as yourself, that kind of stuff. Which is why you may have heard me say from the pulpit is that we got to love our ancient Israelite neighbors and learn how to hear them as they speak to us through the text, right? Which means I have to learn about their encyclopedia of production. What are the base metaphors and images and worldviews that are producing this text, right? I live in a modern world. I live in a modern world that has Jesus always been ubiquitous, right? I knew who Jesus was from growing up. I grew up in a Christian home. But the authors didn't know who Jesus was, right? They had hopes of who Jesus might be, right? They had hopes of who Yahweh might be sending, right? And so I just have to practice not assuming that they're addressing any of this directly to me, right? That's a very difficult thing to do, right? I need to learn about their encyclopedia and not assume that they are addressing all the concerns I have, right? I might have concerns about finance or family, but what if the authors and their encyclopedia of production is not concerned with my concerns? Right? That's a challenge. Right? So I assume rightly that the Bible should shape how I think about everything, myself, the world, others, people, God. It should affect my behavior in some way, right? And I know the ways that I try and affect other people's behavior, and I know that I might try and help somebody come to believe something, but here's how I might do it in my cultural context, but that might not be how they are doing it. So there's nothing for it. Not everybody has to learn Hebrew to become a student of ancient history, right? That's a much larger commitment than many of us are willing to do, right? But you can make efforts, right? You can make efforts. Just like if you want to understand Japanese culture, maybe you don't move to Japan. Maybe you purchase a phrase book, right? Maybe you talk to some Japanese people and ask, hey, do you conceptualize this? Like when we think about a work day, when I think of weekend, what's the weekend to you? Think about any nation that doesn't have a huge history with Christianity shutting down things on Sundays, right? Other cultures don't organize around a Sunday like we do, right? Their weekend is far more fluid. Sometimes the weekend is midweek, right? It's as simple as that, learning the other culture, right? I say that the Lord's Day and the Sabbath is Sunday, but were ancient Jews celebrating the Sabbath and the Lord's Day? That's a good question. Were they the same to the Jews? Or were they different in practice? That's a good question to ask, right? Because I do Sunday and I say that that's my Sabbath, or maybe some of us do, right? But do they? That's a great question, because then it will affect how you read their text, right? You can make efforts to get a phrase book, and that's all we're doing here. This class is, in essence, an attempt to bridge a gap with my neighbors who are so far behind, so far behind me in past now, I can't talk to them, right? I just have to learn about them, right? So we assume that the Bible has something to say, but what I'm convinced we need to do is ask the very important questions. If I'm going to try and hear what the biblical texts have to say about any issue, I need to first hear these authors and hear the text on their terms, and then make my bridge, right? But I will only get that once I set my agenda aside. In a way, this has been a long learning process for me of, okay, how can I hear them? Is my hearing obscured? What's obscuring it, right? The Bible is a personal text to me. So if I have a dog in the fight and the Bible's trying to challenge me, I need to be able to hear that. I need to be able to hear my own hang-up in reading a text, right? Because this is how ancient authors communicate. I don't get to bend them towards my way, right? And so remember what we talked about in the last few weeks is that the people who produce the Bible is a very unique crew of human beings, right? This ancient tradition of prophets, a minority scribal group that comes from Moses. They're all carrying on the torch, right? From everything, the way they compose narratives to the way they compose poetry, what they were doing with these poetry, how they organized them all. It's not like any other literature that you have read before if you're unfamiliar with the ancient Near East, right? So what we have to do is force ourselves to learn a whole new way of seeing the world, right? Just for the very beginning, when the Bible says, "For God so loved the world," what's that image in your head? What do you think of when you hear the word world? You think of Earth, but we live in a post-space world. We have a picture taken from a shuttle that shows us the blue planet, right? We have pictures from the Hubble telescope looking back at Earth and sees a pale blue dot, right? Like Carl Sagan said. But these people didn't have that. So when they hear the word Earth, that's haaretz. It's land, right? They're not thinking the whole globe because they don't have a globe. They don't know that the world's a circle, right? They don't have that yet, right? And so remember, it's not that they're wrong, but they're writing how they experience the world, right? And so these are the dialogues we have to have, right, with ourselves, right? You might say, well, how can we trust them? They're not scientifically accurate. They were not trying to be. And also, they were limited by technology, but they were still brilliant, right? They still had literary chops. They were trying to get a message across, and they didn't need to see the world as a giant globe in order to have that point be made, right? So here we are at the crux of a lesson, right? We're moving into now how to read narrative and how to read poetry and how to hear the ancient authors, right? We've been in practice, right? We're turning the ship a little bit. We're going to set our eyes on learning how to hear our neighbors, right? That's it. That's the task for the next few weeks, right? Thank you. Any questions before we close? Good? Yeah. It's very helpful. One thing that I would recommend is just invest in a Bible. Invest in a Bible that's not one that you typically read, and then promise yourself that that's the one you will read, right? because then text will be unfamiliar to you. There's a Bible that there's a few I would recommend. There's one called The Bible for Everyone. It's written by N.T. Wright, a New Testament scholar, and John Goldingay, an Old Testament scholar. And what they do is they only use so like if you read the Old Testament, instead of Jerusalem, you'll hear Jerusalem. It'll put in it won't translate words out for you. It'll leave some of them for you to like, oh well, okay, that's different. It's important because a lot of names are wordplay. Remember, so sometimes it'll show you the wordplay, and so it's just a helpful little shift, right? Because if you're unfamiliar with the way the text reads, then you have to read it slower. And when you have to read it slower, you scratch your head more. And when you scratch your head more, you ask, I don't understand this. And that's good, because that means that you slow down enough to not miss something, right? So the Bible for Everyone is a good one. The New Testament is free on Bible Gateway. So you can read already the New Testament through Bible Gateway. Another one is the Hebrew Scriptures by Robert Alter. It's kind of pricey, so you can buy book by book. You could just pick your favorite, or you could buy the box set. The entire thing is translated from Hebrew by Robert Alter, but in respective of the poetry and the idiom. So they're not changing anything, right? So like sometimes it'll say prepare yourself, but it's really tie up your robe into your loins, right? But then, yeah, gird up your loins. But there's a bunch of those idioms in Scripture that that people will just translate out for you. So you're not even familiar that there's the Hebrew kind of turn of phrase. So that's a great one. It's the Hebrew Scriptures by Robert Alter. And then the last one that I would recommend is the NRSV. The NRSV is a non-denominational, non-religious translation of the Bible, which means that they were secular authors and scholars who had worked on the translation. Like, not that they're atheists and they just want to screw up the Bible, is that they study other things like Babylonian history, right? So they're just giving you a like there's no agenda that they have, right? Because Christians, we have agenda when we read the Bible, right? And it really shows when we're reading something devotionally, right? So the NRSV is a coalition of religious scholars and non-religious scholars working together to put a text that when they do work together, right, at the academic level, they're on the same page. They know what words that they're using because they're sharing, right? So that's a very helpful one to use. Those are three great options. Just pick one up. The NRSV is available on Bible Gateway for free. You can just read it online through your app, right? The New Testament is available. Robert Alter is the only one that you have to pay for if you want to read it. And if you ever wanted to borrow one, I have one upstairs. So you can, it's set up in the Tanakh, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. So that's it. Any questions before we close? All right. I'll close us in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day, and we thank you for the opportunity to see the hinge of a study, to be able to see the trajectory of where we're going, and to get excited about your text again, I think, and to be excited for what new understanding and new challenges will come and rear their heads to us as we travel through the text. Lord, teach us to be humble as we wander through the aspen grove. Help us to be respective of the ancient histories as we examine the quilt. Lord, teach us to be humble as we read your text, and so that we can hear our ancient Israelite neighbors and listen to them. In your name we pray, amen.